Ladies and gentlemen, it is perhaps strange for many to consider that we are meeting here today to discuss the ethical perspective of a 12th century Azerbaijani poet and its relevance to the contemporary world we live in. But it is easy to see that all those who have been concerned with such eternal issues as justice and freedom, who want to differentiate right from wrong, are continuing in our time the concerns of all people from the earliest of human societies, but cast in the context of our contemporary and incredibly more complex societies. The efforts to systematize the analytical framework within which to address this concern certainly dates at least from the time of the ancient Greeks. They not only tussled with ethics, sometimes referred to as moral philosophy, but also established it as the branch of philosophy that involves systematizing, defending, and recommending concepts of right and wrong conduct. Ethics, along with aesthetics, which is concerned with such value-laden aspects as beauty and social concerns with the concepts of truth and goodness, constitute a domain of philosophy that we sometimes refer to as axiology. Such issues have been at the core of the concerns of philosophers and thinkers, statesmen and writers from that time to the present, no less so in the East than in the West. And in that group of notable global historical figures, Nizami deserves to be recognized and listened to. So today I would like to address two main topics. First, some of the fundamental questions that concern us in global ethics today. Second, I would like to introduce Nizami and his works and present what he had to say about many of the dimensions of these contemporary concerns, albeit from a historical vantage point that, of course, reflects a world of more than 8 centuries ago. I do believe that much of what he said is relevant to our global ethical concerns today, and that his wisdom deserves our attention and respect. If we talk of global ethics today, it is largely through the transformation of the world, through the crucible of war, and the long search for peace, and the growing realization that we are all living on the same planet, linked by an increasingly globalized set of connections. It is thanks to the transformation of our societies, the rise of our megacities, and the technology of our contacts that have underlined our common humanity and the need for shared societies. It is due to the dawning realization that we are all human and our entitlement to our basic human rights cannot be breached. We have by now all acquired an innate belief that issues of human morality, such as good and evil, right and wrong, justice and crime, have a common core that transcends political boundaries. That core is, we now believe, firmly established on the bedrock of human rights. We recognize human rights as the fundamental benchmark against which every social organization, every law, every transaction can and should be measured, even if certain minor variations or rifts are allowed on some of these concepts, such as the socio-cultural definitions of what constitutes virtue and vice in societies over time. There should be no excuse for transgressing the basic human rights of individuals, no matter what the circumstances. Today, globally as much as nationally and locally, we are confronting major issues that I will, for the sake of clarity, limit to 5 fundamental goals we all seek. These are peace, freedom, justice, equality, and sustainability. It is to achieve these 5 goals that we set forth the structure of governance, locally, nationally, and internationally. And that governance must have certain basic characteristics, such as democratic power, which in turn requires pluralism, participation, and the rule of law. In addition, there are certain values that we live by, such as fairness, and values we judge with, such as concepts as truth, goodness, and beauty. So allow me to say a few words about each of these issues before I return to Nizami Ganjavi and his ethics. Of the 5 fundamental goals, peace has become the most fundamental of all. Not only are weapons becoming ever more lethal, but it is increasingly evident that in the absence of peace, whether war is formally declared or considered a domestic affair, it is totally destructive and enters into the realm of folly. But conflict is inherent in the behavior of humans and of societies as well as nation states. Thus, restraints need to be placed on the escalation of conflicts into violent wars. The only alternative is reasoned participatory formulation of a system of laws at the local, national, and international levels to arbitrate disputes without violence. While this may not work in every case, it would help to make such resort to violence as limited as humanly possible. For there is no denying that there will be cases where the use of force may be the only way to protect populations and redress severe conditions of injustice. Even if the war is that which is waged by the state against terrorism, it is usually enough to extend the police powers of the state considerably and to put at risk due process of law, invade privacy, and extend the barriers of surveillance, investigative, and interrogation that police use frequently to flagrant breaches of people's constitutional and human rights, all in the name of security. These are undoubtedly complex matters, and legal philosophies may differ on the extent to which such breaches can be tolerated. But there is no question that the absence of peace, real peace, is detrimental to all that we expect and demand of our societies and to the ethical values that we want to uphold. In fact, peace, real peace, is more than the absence of war or conflict. It is a condition in which every individual is allowed to participate fully in the life of the community and to reach their own full potential to give to the community the full measure of his or her talents. That, of course, requires freedom. Freedom. It is that which we all want. Freedom of choice, freedom of expression, and its corollaries, access to information and transparency, have become central to our conception of the ethics that should govern our relations in this day and age. For our pluralistic societies, our creative diversity, if it is to survive the growing interaction between peoples, requires that acceptance of the other become inbred, and further, that it must be nurtured to go beyond the acceptance of the principle of freedom of expression to the commitment to defend that right for all those with whom we disagree. Indeed, in this day and age, it is essential to defend that right even for those whose views we find offensive. For it is precisely offensive speech and obnoxious views that require protection in the name of freedom of expression. Surely, conventional thoughts and mainstream speech do not require protection, precisely because they are so acceptable to the majority. I will not belabor the point as to what constitutes free expression, as that has benefited from several centuries of debate with generations of free spirits willing to put their well-being and even their very lives on the line to defend the crucial rights that we now have learned to take for granted. Today, it is expression in any medium, including and especially the internet, and using any form of expression, be it language, music, or the arts, that needs to be defended. How do we do this? Justice. Justice has to be the cornerstone of any social organization. And if modern democratic states are based on a social contract that unites the human family within its borders in a framework of citizenship, then the felt presence of a modicum of social justice is the necessary glue that will hold that society together. But social justice has many dimensions. How do we get there? To my mind, the two pillars of achieving social justice are freedom and equality. Freedom entails the exercise of rights, and that requires that we have the capabilities to exercise these rights. And that may need to take into account the innate inequalities between individual capabilities. But while the principles of justice can be argued at great length, there is a general perception that we can recognize when actions or outcomes are fair or unfair. We do recognize that something may be perfectly legal, but it is still unfair and therefore unjust. Hence the notion that justice must be tempered with mercy. But there is an ironclad rule that is now as widely accepted as the concept of human rights, and that is equality of all citizens before the law. Equality. To measure equality before the law is but a start. Some people would see fairness as the provision of equal opportunities only. If the result is to have some who are extremely rich and some who are extremely poor, so be it. But others, most of us in fact, would see that a society where some people are lighting cigars with $1,000 bills and others are starving is inherently unjust, whatever the starting position was and whatever the procedural guarantees have been. Extreme inequality is corrosive. It hardens the attitudes of the rich and powerful towards the poor and lowly. It builds acceptance of the incongruity of wealth amidst misery and exclusion. It undermines the very notions of social justice and social cohesion. It makes a mockery of fairness and leads to the slippery path of class warfare as the only means of redress. Ill fares the land to hastening ills a prey, where wealth accumulates and men decay. So said Oliver Goldsmith in 1770, and it remains true to this day. Indeed, recent studies have confirmed our suspicions that far from being a necessary corollary to compensate the talented and inventive, those forces in society that propel society forward, excessive inequality is inefficient and is associated with a wide variety of social ills. But all efforts to provide equality of outcome have run afoul of the inherent different endowments of people, as witnessed in communist societies who ideologically pursued such notions. Thus, most of us would demand a minimum of decent standards of living in the outcome, in addition to equality of opportunity in the start position. Perhaps it is better to talk of equity rather than equality. The former is more relational, the latter more absolute. Equity is defined as something that is just, impartial, and fair, that leads to a view of justice applied in circumstances covered by law, yet influenced by principles of ethics and fairness. How these must be exercised can and will change over time as social circumstances change. And today we are also concerned with sustainability. Sustainability is to leave to future generations as many, if not more, opportunities than we have had ourselves. It requires that our actions today prove sustainable in economic, ecological, and social terms. And this vision of sustainable development is one that is people-centered and gender-conscious, that seeks equity for all and recognizes the interdependence of all living things, an ethical vision that will lead us to act fairly to each other, to nature, and to future generations. To pursue these fundamental goals, we have to address the issue of governance and the values on which good governance is founded. Pluralism, the rule of law, transparency, accountability, free expression, and free flow of information are as necessary to good governance as the participation of the citizens. We have come to see these as synonymous with democracy which adds the element of the legitimacy of the ruling government being based on the consent of the governed, usually expressed by periodic elections. Government of the people, by the people, for the people. But while we may argue about the details of how that is best achieved, one of the fundamental challenges we face in our world today is how to ensure pluralism and openness to the other. For pluralism and diversity, while they can be enriching, can also be a source of conflict and strife. And here we come to the values that motivate citizens and societies. Social norms and individual values make a society function. They provide the trust, the glue that holds a society together and make transactions possible. Values we live by and we judge with give meaning to such abstract concepts as truth, goodness, and beauty. Then with that background, we can turn to Nizami and his writings. What did Nizami actually say? Well, like all the great teachers, Nizami favored the use of parables and metaphors to impart his wisdom. Nizami lived in the 12th century, and understandably, he did not discuss issues like democracy, but he devoted much of his writing to how wise rulers should rule and on how courageous but impetuous rulers should acquire wisdom. He believed that wise rulers should serve justice and protect human dignity. And all of that runs throughout much of his work, told in parables, anecdotes, and stories. You can track endless examples from the vignette found in the second of the 20 didactic chapters of the Treasure House of the Mysteries, where two owls standing in a ruined and deserted village opine that if the ruler continues his bad governance, all the villages would look like this deserted and ruined village. Onwards to the epic adventures of Bahram Gur in the Haft Paikar and of Alexander the Great in the Iskandar Nama, where the flamboyant, courageous rulers learn wisdom along the way and return as wise rulers to tend to the duties of leadership and to spread the words of wisdom to others. Nizami believed that political stability must be based on justice and equity, and that is essential. And he did support openness to the other and pluralism. And he lived by his values and advised his son to avoid proximity of power and the palace intrigues that accompany the lust for power. And he says, refrain from seeking the society of kings, like exposing dry cotton to fire's burnings. Light from the fire may be pleasant enough, but to be safe, one must stay a distance off. Moth that's allured by the flame of a candle is burnt when a companion at the banquet table. Now today, at a time when the practice of politics gives accolades to those who win, frequently without adequate attention to how they got there, it is important to be reminded that already over 800 years ago, Nizami warned not just of the corrupting influence of the exercise of power, but also of the corruption that comes in the pursuit of power. But what about peace, with which I started? Well, he believed in peace and nonviolence. In looking back at his own life, he could observe, for as long as I have lived, never in violent way has the wing of a fly been bent. Never mixed dregs in another's fresh water, sought to disturb another's condition. Never. But Nizami went further. Not only did he advocate not doing harm to one's enemies, but also that the best way to use one's short time here on this earth was to be good to one's neighbors and friends. And he says, from dusk to dawn for life to stay is hopeless. The only seed worth growing is the seed of goodness. And because the world will not stay for anyone, being kind to one's friends is best, and that I stress. He advocated leading a virtuous life without greed. In your village, upon your own private estate, don't think of eating from another's plate. Fortune will turn upon the unthinking fellow whose foot beyond his garment will allow. But perhaps most striking is his attitude towards pluralism. Nizami was open to all the cultures of his time. He told all to be open to all the cultures of the world, and that they would benefit enormously from such openness. He says in the Khiradnameh that he researched in all the tongues and found pearls and gems of wisdom that he collected and polished with his poetry to integrate them into a whole. He says, from every manuscript some worth came to me. I found and embellished it with jewels of poetry. I filled up my store from the more recent history, the Jewish and the Armenian, and also the Pahlavi. I took from every grain that which was excellent, and in from each pod the innermost kernel went. I joined riches of one tongue to those of another, and the mass into a complete whole did I gather. But beyond pluralism lies the question of equality. Equality with minorities, equality between rich and poor, equality before God, before the law, equality in gender issues. This is the most critical issue in most societies. Gender equality remains the litmus test, especially in Eastern societies. Now here, it is important to remind ourselves that Nizami was writing over 800 years ago, and yet he surprises us there too. Let us review his depiction of women. Now, women in Nizami's epic romantic poems are endowed with great beauty, elevated on a pedestal, and are objects of desire that inspire men to great deeds, as when Farhad literally moves mountains to win the love of Shireen. But the greatness of Nizami is that he does not limit himself to this typical idealized view of women so prevalent in his times and found in so many of the chivalry tales in East and West, where beautiful and chaste damsels in distress inspire courageous knights to slay the dragon and rescue the damsel. Nizami portrayed women as full-blooded creatures, well-rounded, who evolved over time, and who could be the equal of men in every way, even in the most unusual, such as physical strength. A striking example of this is how the coquettish Fitna in the Haft Paikar achieves that. She tells the king that anything can be achieved by determination because practice makes perfect. She is sent to her death for her insolence, but is spared and lives unknown for 6 years, during which she learns to carry a calf on her shoulders and carry it up and down 60 steps, a feat that few men could equal in physical strength. Likewise, it is a wise woman, Queen Nushaba of Barda, who teaches an important lesson to Alexander the Great in the Iskandernameh. The queen, who had recognized Alexander, who had come disguised as a messenger, tells him that she knows who he is, and then offers Alexander jewels and gold to eat, which he refuses, to which she points out that yet men are killed for such treasure, and then offers him bread which is produced by the same men who are killed for the inedible jewels and stones. In Nizami's world, women learn, and his princesses are educated, skillful, and wise, as well as beautiful. In Layla and Majnun, the two adolescents meet in school, where they study together until Qais is smitten by Layla's beauty. Thus, Nizami's views of women as complete beings that can match men in intellect, determination, wisdom, and even physical strength, as well as being beautiful, evanescent creatures that attract and inspire men, is noteworthy. It is one more interesting facet of the magnificent sage of Ganja. But what about human behavior and reforming society? Well, Nizami also advised his son to learn the importance of speaking truth, respecting the law, and avoiding lies and legal trickeries. From the Farsi verses translated by Smith, he says, "But let the law instruct you in God's service. Let it not teach you how to lie," and this I stress. 400 years later, in Hamlet, Shakespeare would elegantly rephrase the same thoughts in the lines he gives Polonius, "This above all to thine own self be true, and it must follow as the night the day, thou canst not then be false to any man." Nizami was a profound humanist who believed in the innate goodness of people and their perfectibility. He wrote much about the values that individuals should adopt in their lives, and he was deeply concerned with society and the human condition, to the point that MacDonald would write that Nizami was a genuine social reformer. But what about beyond daily living and the search for wisdom? Nizami wrote many beautiful poems, which are collected in his divan, beyond his famous 5 epic masterpieces. The poems are mostly of a religious or admonitory or ethical character, and which contain indications and symbols for the initiated. So the sage was always present in the poet, and the religious mystic was there in the quiet man who lived his simple, virtuous country life, producing his stream of historic masterpieces. His death in 1209 would leave a void in the world of literature, but he bequeathed the world an enormous legacy. To those who want wisdom, he recommends that they should choose the profound and mystical path of spiritual enlightenment through Sufism. But he warned that it requires the crushing of one's ego to seek the higher truth. Now, this is clearly expressed in Nizami's divan as given by Smith's rendition. "I went to the wine house last night, but the way in I couldn't see. I called and called, but no one inside seemed to listen to me." And then the wine seller finally answers him saying, "It is not the time when doors open for one and anyone. Be more thoughtful. It's no mosque where door is always open, where you can come and go and push to the front deliberately. Every religious community in the world is here. Muslims, Hindus, Zoroastrians, Christians, Jews, one community. Listen if you've anything to say. Then first you should go and make yourself dust under their feet." It is that easy. It is clear that Nizami is not speaking of a literal tavern where wayfarers and locals go to imbibe real wine and get drunk. Rather, Nizami is speaking of the notion of wisdom, which transcends mere religious practice. Note, it is no mosque whose door is always open. And to reach that house of wisdom, you must take the mystical path, and that mystical path requires first that you overcome your ego, your pride, and make yourself dust under the feet of all the wise from all the traditions. And then, and only then, will you gain the insights that will allow you to move towards gaining wisdom. Ladies and gentlemen, Nizami's work is more than a paramount symbol of great literature. It is indeed part of the global heritage of humanity. It has, like all great legacies, reached universality through deep-rooted traditions interpreted with great art. It combines the storyteller's skill with the lyrical language of the poet. In addition, we all feel that beyond the art and craft of the wordsmith and the storyteller, there is the sincerity of Nizami. You feel that his sense of justice is not feigned. His spirituality reflects genuine piety, not a showy religiosity. His deep concern for the human condition is not just for the characters in his epics, but for all people. He continues to inspire. And in the 20th century, Abdul Naim Hassanain, Egypt's most eminent specialist of Farsi and Persian literature, would devote his masterwork in Arabic to Nizami and his times, and he appropriately titled it Nizami Ganjavi, the Poet of Virtue, an appropriate testimonial to the great Azerbaijani and his enduring legacy. Nizami lives. His values still inspire and have stood the test of time. And when we think of global ethics, it is appropriate to reflect on the views of the sage of Ganja, the great Nizami. Thank you.